Hi, I'm Karen, and I'm a freelance visual artist in Calgary. I'm a person who draws fairly often, but last studied drawing at university 20 years ago. So I'm definitely in need of a bit of a refresh, or more like a hard reset. As usual, I found the solution in books, specifically classic drawing instruction books. Our first selection is The Elements of Drawing by John Ruskin. I'm looking for helpful techniques and habits, which are here in abundance. For most of you, who is likely what you're asking right now. Ruskin hasn't been a household name outside of certain parts of England since perhaps the 1930s, but his credentials for teaching you how to draw are impeccable. John Ruskin was born in 1819 in London and brought up as the only child in a strict Protestant household by parents who encouraged his interests in art, literature, and the Romantic movement. The family also traveled across Europe extensively. All these experiences stayed with young John throughout his life. Ruskin studied at Oxford University, then went on to write cultural criticism, teach art theory and practice in classrooms and tutoring sessions, and speak about modern painters and Gothic architecture. He was probably the biggest fan ever of landscape painter J.M.W. Turner, plus a friend and promoter of the Pre-Raphaelite group of artists and crafters, and a mentor to Oscar Wilde. He lived till 1900 and age 80. Ruskin's ideas on social reform, heritage site preservation, and education methods were quite progressive for his day and remain broadly influential. As an Oxford professor, Ruskin established the Ruskin School of Drawing in 1871 as the school's fine art department. It retains his name to this day. Clearly, drawing is at the heart of all art creation, in his view, as well as a key aspect within a well-rounded general education. Ruskin's own drawings are quite great and seem almost ahead of their time, containing rougher and more detailed sections. Still, he only thought of them as technique examples or accompaniments to his descriptive writing, so not really art pieces in and of themselves. These figures appear throughout 1857's The Elements of Drawing, his instruction manual written in response to many requests for such a resource. The book is divided into 3 letters for students. Letter 1 is on first practice, the absolute basics, and letter 2 is sketching from nature. For this video, we're just going to leave letter 3 for another day because it's basically about watercolor painting. In any case, we have more than enough to occupy ourselves with in letters 1 and 2, which is conveniently the first half of this book and about 100 pages. Ruskin doesn't introduce figure drawing or perspective to beginners, to which I say, thank goodness. Likewise, I'm just using modern materials here, or as close as I can find to what's recommended. The book starts with, after several introductions and prefaces, typical old book, 10 lessons denoted by Roman numerals. Lesson 1 is shading cross lines. Lesson 2 immediately calls out Lesson 1 as tiresome. Ruskin describes his own lessons as tiresome or irksome pretty often, which is an amusing level of self-awareness for the 19th century. No wonder he was one of Oscar Wilde's mentors, they're both quite witty. 2 through 5 involve outlines, more shading, gradients, straight lines, all pretty abstract and fundamental. Not till we get to Lesson 6 are we drawing objects and not just making marks. Lesson 8 is the one we're going to focus on for the next little while. This involves a stone, the logic being that you can pretty much find a stone in a road or a garden or anywhere. The man likes stones. He has another book called The Stones of Venice. We're cheating a bit here because it specifically says not to use a shiny stone, and this one's a little bit polished, but I didn't want to go outside, so I just used a nearby stone in my home office. Anyway, this nearby stone turns out to be pretty powerful. This is what Ruskin says. For all drawing depends primarily on your power of representing roundness. If you can do that, all the rest is easy and straightforward. If you cannot do that, nothing else that you may be able to do will be of any use. He goes on, for nature, capital, is all made up of roundnesses, plural, Not the roundness of perfect globes. He has a whole thing about it's not important to be able to draw perfect circles, which you saw me using a stencil earlier. He recommends a compass, but again, we're adapting to what I have. He seems okay that I can't draw a perfect circle, nor should any artist be expected to be. But anyway, back to the quote. Not perfect globes, but of various curved surfaces. Bows are rounded, leaves are rounded, stones, clouds, cheeks, curls. They're just all round. That's what he is saying. There is no more flatness in the natural world than there is vacancy. The world itself is round, and so is all that is in it, more or less, except human work, which is often very flat indeed. Oh, the wit. He finishes, therefore, set yourself steadily to conquer that round stone, and you have won the battle. Well, I shouldn't quite say finished, because he goes on to describe shading quite a bit more in the numbered sections. The numbered sections are actually different than the numbered lessons. I don't know why the paragraphs are numbered 1 through 245. I would guess that it has something to do with maybe Ruskin's Bible studies upbringing, but that's a bit of a reach on my part. You can see the stone has been thoroughly conquered, or at least one sketch of many, I'm sure. Moving on to the next exercise that I'm going to share with you. This is from section 112 of the book and involved drawing from a photo. So I've selected a photo from the Alberta Historical Review. Very perfect, although not very reminiscent of England. It's prairies. You'll notice that I said the section instead of the exercise number. Ruskin actually stops giving exercise headers with Roman numerals in section 72, confident that you can now draw, quote, more beautiful and complicated things. So after lesson 10, the last one in the numbered series, the lessons get a little more freeform and tend to flow into each other, which is actually quite nice for reading the book, but a little confusing for doing the lessons. There's a lot of subjects to fill the remainder of letter 1. You're advised to draw the bough of a tree, every common tree in fact, which alone would be weeks or months of work, plus quite a few descriptions of trees, all their bits and pieces, and also advice to look at how masters like Durer and Rembrandt, and of course Turner, portray trees and other natural objects. I'd say, of course, to adapt this to where you actually live, but still read the descriptions because they're quite charming and lovely, and it'll keep you in the right headspace. Ruskin apparently hated nonsense lines in drawing books, which, to do a little editorializing, I've always hated too. So I feel like I've found a kindred spirit from a previous century. This is a problem that has been facing artists for a while. I'm going to insert an example of the sort of drawing instructions that I don't find very helpful that you'll see in about 80% of drawing books that are still available to this day. And I imagine it was even worse in Ruskin's time. So it's basically a few lines or shapes, and then question mark, and then a finished drawing. So you're pretty much left to maybe copy or trace the finished drawing, which is absolutely the opposite of all the observational drawing that Ruskin thinks is absolutely fundamental for artists to understand the world and physical environments and how objects work in space, and things that fortunately are pretty commonly taught in art schools today based on his influence, and I'm sure many others observing the same problems. This is how Ruskin actually describes bad drawing versus good. In an old house, a bad observer and a bad draftsman would only see and only draw the spotty irregularity of tiles or slates all over. But a good draftsman will see all the bends under the timbers, where they are weakest and the weight is telling on them the most, and the tracks of the run of the water in time of rain, when it runs off fastest, and where it lies long and feeds the moss. It goes on, but it's basically saying that a good draftsman would observe the past and the future as conveyed in the physical details of the objects. Now, I'm sure you've all seen drawings where someone has just sketched like stones. I use stones again, but stones, tiles, rocks, flooring, ceiling, whatever, over and over and over again. And you're like, wow, that seems like a lot of work. But it's like, you shouldn't perhaps look at a really, really, really good drawing and be like, wow, it must have taken a lot of work to make that, rather than you're feeling like moved or inspired, or that you specifically understand what the artist sees, rather than they put a lot of work into making marks on the page. That's not to say, of course, if you come across a drawing that you find quite proficient or emotionally moving, that has that technique, that means someone knows how to use it properly. But I think Ruskin is talking about the beginner tendency to just repeat the same lines and not give them a lot of character or meaning. My takeaway from Ruskin is that all lines should have a purpose. Lines add up to masses and forms. Outlines are good for contour drawing exercises, similar to the ones that Ruskin discusses, but his method of drawing is certainly not draw the outline of an object and fill it in. It's certainly more like building up an object from expressive lines. It's funny to think that the world that Ruskin exists in, the mid-19th century, includes photographs, but not seemingly photos of something like a cloud. The exposure times for film just didn't allow for capturing something that moves every few minutes. So he recommends sketching clouds, but you have to kind of adapt. So it's actually all these little observations on very specific things that add up to making this book an enjoyable read in and of itself, rather than just a series of rote exercises that would be similar to the books that Ruskin complains about from the famous European art academies that teach you like formulas. His ecological concerns really come out in the passages about, say, clouds, because it says you can hide them with smoke and mix them with poison, but they can't be quarried or built over, and therefore are always gloriously arranged. So you can't pave the sky, basically. Towards the end of letter 2 of this book, so part 2 of 3, Ruskin begins to describe some pretty complicated things, like describing reflections on water, curves, using a lot of references to, again, the old European masters and how they were able to capture these in a way that he approved of, apparently. And then that actually leads into letter 3, which is called Color and Composition. In Victorian times, watercolor was actually considered a form of drawing. I would say today we probably would think of it more as painting. Nonetheless, I'm not discouraged. I can tackle watercolor another day, so hopefully you'll stick with me through this series and we can discover the joy of wet media together. I've actually used ink here. The results came out a little bit abstract and weird, but a little unexpected, so I'm pretty happy with that. John Ruskin tells us over and over again that it isn't easy to learn to draw, and that you should ignore the advice of anyone who wants you to make drawings that are pretty or bold for them while you're learning. But he promises the results will be worthwhile. I'm aboard with his methods. Are you?